Okay, welcome back, everyone. Thanks for joining us here again. Jim, thanks for joining me.
You betcha. Happy to be here.
You were happy to be here yesterday. It's great to see you still happy.
Yeah.
And nice shirt, by the way.
Wearing the uniform.
That's right. As promised yesterday, we in yesterday's Winter is Coming webinar with Jim and Stockman Grass Farmer, we said that if we didn't get to all the questions yesterday, that Jim and I would catch up and run through some of those questions, and we'll have those sent out to you shortly. So without further ado, we'll jump into some of those questions, Jim. I'll just pull them up on the page in the background, and we'll run through them one on one, and let's get going.
All righty. Of course, we could just say it depends and call the session done.
Well,
but we're going to go through them. All right, let's do it.
It always does depend. And just so everyone does know that there were a few questions that were really quite similar. So we've just rounded those up into a couple of sort of the general theme-based questions, and hopefully everyone gets the answers they're after. If you do have any more questions, always drop us a line and we can get back in touch. But question one we have from Brad in Montana. I buy alfalfa from my neighbour cheap and bale graze on my pastures during winter. I'm trying to increase the organic and mineral content of my soil. In Kick the Hay Habit, you mentioned the minerals are essentially the same cost as the hay. Two questions. Oh, so Brad is getting a little bit greedy here. He's got two questions. First question, when calculating my gross margin, how should I categorize the cost of the hay and increase the value to the soil? Since my intent is to leave the considerable amount of this forage on the ground, do I need to just take a long-term approach and monitor the increase of my gross product? Should I set up an expense category for improving the soil and allocate the portion of feed cost to that? Is there a standard way to quantify this return on investment, since it is a short-term annual investment with a long-term multi-year gain? Now, he said he had two questions. There are about 7 in there, but that's all good. But we'll go to his first group of 7 questions. What are your comments there, Jim?
My comments is, I know Brad from Missoula, and he always has questions. So hi, Brad. Good to hear from you again. All right. When I have said at times in the past that the value of the nitrogen and minerals in hay may be equal to the price of hay, the cost of the hay itself, that's more in the eastern half of the United States, where we have a lot of hobby farmers and small deals, and nobody really knows what it costs for them to produce hay, so they sell hay below their cost of production. When you move to the west and we get into irrigated alfalfa and things like that, generally speaking, the cost of the hay is substantially more than the value of the nitrogen and mineral nutrition in it. If we take current U.S. prices for fertilizer costs for NPK, calcium, sulfur, and then take all the micro minerals and put a livestock mineral price on it, a ton of hay in the U.S. right now has about $50 to $60 nitrogen and mineral nutrition in it. Okay, so if you are buying hay, we'll say for $120 a ton, basically you have 50% of what you paid for the hay coming onto your ranch or farm as potentially fertilizer. Brad's idea of setting up an expense column in his accounting for soil amendments, he could easily put 50% of the cost of that hay, or I shouldn't say 50%, he can assign $50 or something of that hay cost to soil amendments. Yeah, it would be perfectly legitimate to do that. If you are in that eastern part of the country where the cost of the hay might be the value of the nitrogen and minerals in it, you got the choice. Either you're getting your hay for free or you're getting your fertilizer for free. And so you can go with it that way. I may have missed the 6th question in that array, but I think I largely covered that question.
Yeah, I think he was talking about, is there a standard way to quantify this return? I think you've sort of answered that.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that's, long-term multi-year gain, etc. But I think you've covered that nicely. Now to Brad's second question. Let's see how many questions he's got in this second question. It's all good. I love questions. Is it better, in your opinion, Jim, to let the cows or sheep eat the bale in one static location, or is it better to roll the bale out? This may be a trick question because I find rolling the bale out cycles more through the cow over the larger area, and leaving it in one place cycles more through the soil, but all in one small area. Thus, the two different practices result in two different outcomes. So which is more profitable? Perhaps you've answered this in the new edition of Quality Pasture, which you just started reading. But I guess this all depends as well. I mean, strategic placement of bale grazing is something that I've seen more of in the States and what have you, but primarily this audience on this webinar is States-based. So I'll hand that straight back to you, Jim. What are your thoughts?
Okay, so bale grazing probably originated more in Canada, and then it has spread to the US. I greatly prefer to unroll bales, flake off big squares, and spread it over an area. One of the reasons for this is I have looked at the bale arrangements in many bale feeding areas and looked at it on a per acre basis, done the computation of the nitrogen, phosphorus, and even some other minerals, but mostly we've looked at nitrogen and phosphorus. And at the bale spacing that a lot of cattle producers are using, the urinary nitrogen, not total nitrogen, but just urinary nitrogen, which is almost immediately available in the soil. The nitrogen application rate in some of these bale graze areas is 300 to 500 pounds per acre, which is a gross over application of nitrogen, can contribute to, groundwater pollution, to excess runoff, can even kill some of the grass out there. So if you're going to do bale grazing, I think you need to go through the computation of how much nutrients are you loading onto that area, because in many, many cases, we are overloading the ecosystem with nitrogen and phosphorus in those situations. When we roll the hay out, flake off of the back of the flatbed, the square bales, you can actually, once you understand the nutrient content in a ton of hay, you just figure, okay, to get 100 units of N put on this area, I need to feed 7 tons of hay per acre. And so you figure out then what does your spacing need to be on unrolling bales or the lines you're driving with the hay truck, and put on what is actually a much more reasonable amount of hay. Bottom line is, I'm not a big fan of bale grazing because most people do it at such a concentration that it's actually almost a point source pollution act.
That's interesting. Out of obviously, the author of Kick the Hay Habit, I don't imagine you're a huge fan of bale grazing at all. But in all of those spreadsheets and calculations and what have you that are available to people, and I know that are available through the Stockman Grass Farmer Grazing School deal package. Do you have any of those calculations and spreadsheets for calculating areas in nitrogen impact?
Absolutely, we do. And if just off the top of my head, I think that particular calculator is called hay as fertilizer. And if you have the protein analysis on your hay and any other mineral, composition analysis, in that worksheet, you can determine what the appropriate feeding rate in terms of tons of hay per acre. If you set what you want the target nitrogen application rate to be, and it will tell you how much.
Yeah, great. I haven't actually seen that. I'm going to go and check that one out. That's great. Righto. Next question, Jim. Where are some good places to get a forage sample tested, or can we buy our own forage sample testers? And that was
Okay.
anonymous.
Go ahead. To the best of my knowledge, there is no realistic do-it-yourself, hey, quality testing kit out there. Almost all of the state labs, whether that's through the Department of Agriculture or the Land Grant University, they do forage analysis. And one thing to understand about getting a forage analysis done is all of these labs are certified. And it's not like you could split up that forage sample, send it, to 6 different labs and get 6 very different answers back. They're all going to come out pretty close. So whatever the local lab for run by either the university or State Department of Agriculture will give you good results. If someone wants a specific place because they don't trust any government agency, a lot of our clients use Ward Lab out of Kearney, Nebraska. They do routine soil samples. They do Haney test soil samples. They do various biological tests, and they also do forage analysis. So for one-stop shopping to get, all of your analytical needs on your farm or ranch done, I think Ward Lab, Kearney, Nebraska, is a good place to go.
And tell me, Jim, just on that, what sort of turnaround time should you be aiming for to ensure that actual result is indicative of what you're looking at now? Because when you took that sample, that could have been days ago or whatever. And I guess that is also season dependent, and what changes are occurring in time from the moment that you're doing what you're doing.
Yeah, that is a good basis to shop. If you check with the lab and they tell you it's going to be 3 weeks before you get results, you probably want to look somewhere else. We're usually looking at 5 to 7 days. Now, if you send your sample next day UPS or next day FedEx and they get it, you might have samples back in 3 days. If you send them, by the U.S. Postal Service and it takes a little longer to get there. And this is why very often it's good to do it at whatever your state lab is. Because if you're in California and you're going to send samples to Kearney, Nebraska, or you're in New York and you're going to send samples to Kearney, Nebraska, and you're doing it by U.S. mail, you have just probably added an extra 3 days to your turnaround time. So the state lab, whatever is closest to you, is very often your best choice, just because they have shorter delivery time to get there. And an awful lot of them, are just a few days. To me, shop on the basis of getting your results back in, say, 4 to 7 days, and that's a good way to select your lab.
Yeah, good stuff. Time is money. Now I'll just bring this back up. I'm just having a little bit of trouble. For those wondering why my head's cut off, as Jim was complaining a moment ago that if I leaned too far forward, he was getting so much glare.
Too far back.
Too far back, he was getting so much glare that he was unable to see the screen. So,
hey, show the audience; they got to know what this.
Oh, I mean, I think everyone saw enough of it yesterday. So, anyway, here we are. Next question, and Betsy, this is one that came from you, and it came through while Jim was talking about digestibility yesterday. Apologies, I didn't just jump in and interrupt him. Betsy from Big Timber, Montana. Good to have you on the call yesterday. Betsy asked, not sure if I missed it, but what is digestibility and how is it measured? Now, I'm sure Betsy knows what digestibility is, but I think it's important to, to when we're talking about those ratios, Jim, really how is that being measured and to give that consistent sort of flow through of data and ratios that you were talking about yesterday.
Okay. Hi, Betsy. Good to hear from you. Digestibility is how, it's basically expressed as a percentage, how much of that bulk forage material can the ruminant animal actually digest. The components in the plant cells, in actively growing cells, we have sugar that's just been created by photosynthesis. We have some little more complex compounds coming into place. But what we call the cell solubles are very easily digested. It's like us popping sugar pills, basically. So that is always a component of the digestible fraction of the plant. And then we have things like cellulose, hemicellulose, lignin. Lignin is virtually indigestible. Hemicellulose, part of that structure is digestible, some is not. Cellulose, the more mature the plant is, the stronger the structure of the cellulose and the less digestible it is. We have more digestible forms of cellulose in vegetative plants. So the analysis takes all of those digestible components out of the plant. And I described yesterday that we can do this by putting a sample in a nylon mesh bag open up the porthole on the sides of the cow, put the mesh bag in there, leave it there for 12 hours, 24, 36, 48, whatever we want. And in some research, we're pulling it out every hour because that's how you measure the rate of digestion. That is messy, nasty. You absolutely do not want to have one of those cows with a porthole in her side and think that that's a do-it-yourself forage testing kit, because it ain't. It is a mess. And then we have other techniques in the lab to get away from doing it in the live animal. But digestibility is the expression of the energy that's in that plant that a ruminant animal can extract both from the cell solubles and the fiber components of that plant.
Fantastic, and thanks, Jim, and apologies, Betsy, for not jumping in there yesterday and getting that answer on the fly. I think it would have been really good for everyone to hear that, but hopefully people pick that up following this recording. Next question, and I remember yesterday it sort of fired in around the same time when Betsy asked that one, was, did you have any information on grazing combined corn stalks and what value is there and what supplement is needed? That's from Wayne in Idaho.
Okay. I bet that's Wayne Hungate over by Meridian or somewhere. Hi, yeah, Wayne.
It might be.
Okay. Yeah, I shouldn't be naming names because that puts people at risk when your name is publicly put out there.
I'm giving people relative
yeah.
anonymity, and you're just blowing it out of the water.
Yeah, I know. It's just I know so many of those people out there that if I haven't seen you lately, I got to say hi. All right. So corn stalks, if it's shelled corn, those crop residues are pretty good feed. We have leaves out there, which are the grain is actually the most digestible part of it. We have leaves out there, which are good quality feed. The husks from the ear are decent. It's the stalks where we tend to have lower quality. So the kind of the old traditional rule of thumb was that for each acre of corn, you should expect to get about 30 grazing days, 30 animal unit days from that. And the stock would do pretty well in the first month or so following harvest. But then after they gleaned the grain, the leaves away, there might be a lot of stalks left out there, but they would be low value. The cattle couldn't utilize those without supplementation. Supplementation with protein, and then also they're inadequate in energy if it's just the stalk that the animal can get. So that was the old rule of thumb, was 30 days of relatively good performance, but it needed to happen within a couple months of harvest. With controlled grazing, work that's been done, and University of Nebraska, Iowa State University, a number of other schools have done it, but because Nebraska and Iowa are big names in ag schools, we'll cite them. They have found that you can double or get 2.5 times as much grazing, quality grazing out of corn stalks, I shouldn't say corn stalks, I should say corn crop residue. If you do controlled grazing, you can get good animal performance much later into the winter, and you get a lot more stock days per acre. I know some outfits that basically their dry cows spend the entire winter out on corn stalks. If you're in deep snow country, that doesn't work, but kind of through the southern plains, upper south, if you manage it right, you can go a long, long time on corn crop residue.
And I don't have that much experience with grazing corn residue, etc. But what I did see there at Meat Animal Research there at Clay Centre, what they were achieving there was quite impressive. I was there sort of late December, 18 months ago or so, and those cattle were performing incredibly well. Just before Christmas, they're eating that corn stalk or corn residue. It was phenomenal. Actually, I was really surprised.
Yeah, I want to just throw in one more thing interesting on if you have corn on a center pivot and you're going to graze the crop residue, you can hang your electric fence on the pivot, and to do your strip grazing, advance that pivot so far each day, and basically you don't go out there and reel up fence, stick posts in the ground. The electric fence is suspended from the pivot towers, or there's a new system where it actually hangs from the drops. And so that's a pretty cool way of doing strip grazing on crop residue, is just use your center pivot for the lead fence. You just establish a baseline fence where you begin grazing, and then you just advance the pivot away from that. Pretty cool.
It is cool. And while you're just talking there, Jim, I just found the photo that I took while I was at Clay Centre with those cows grazing in the residue, and it was the first time I've actually had a cow look at me in the face and wink at me. Now, I don't know what that really means, but I've got it here on my phone that everyone can probably see.
I got to see this winking cow.
You got to look at this winking cow, Jim.
Oh yeah, that's crazy.
But anyway, we move on. Okay. Next question was from Daryl in Canada. Thanks for joining yesterday, Daryl. Is the goal to have a vegetative plant at the end of the season? If so, are nitrates ever a concern?
Okay. That's a real it depends question. So I'm going to start at one end of the spectrum. For those of us who graze dormant rangeland in the winter, we accumulate the growth of the entire season to have that winter feed supply. So no, we can't go into winter with a vegetative plant. It is a fully mature plant. All right, that's one end of the spectrum. When I was in Missouri and we were stockpiling a lot of tall fescue, our grazing management through the summer was designed to push that plant to the point where anything, and we would begin our stockpile accumulation period 60 to 75 days before the end of the growing season. And absolutely our objective there was to have a vegetative plant going into the winter. We can talk about annual forages. And depending on what particular species we're talking about, like if you plant oats in the late summer, and we know oats is a spring crop, but if you plant it in the late summer, it will make a lot of feed growth in the fall, and it may go ahead and head out before the end of the growing season. We would rather have oats kind of at a late boot, maybe very early heading stage when we set out to graze it in the fall. And so you can use the time of seeding, seed that crop late enough, and it'll not get to a fully headed out stage by the time the freeze kills it. But because we're looking for feed quality and vegetative forages higher energy and protein than is mature headed out forage, yes, as a general rule, we would like to go into the winter with a vegetative plant. But in a rangeland setting, we cannot do that.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Next one off the rank. Oh yeah, Jim, I know that you want to comment about this. It was, you did talk about water and wire a little bit yesterday, but this question was about how do you position your water tanks during strip grazing? Give the cattle a path to set a heated trough or movable trough?
Okay. What I wanted to say about this, when we use movable water tanks, whether this is winter or summer, we always prefer to set our tank actually up against an electric fence. We do not want the tank out there where animals can get on all four sides of it. If you do that and you have any kind of water system failure and that tank does go dry, or even in a situation where with a smaller tank and not a lot of volume of water there to give it weight, if you have animals on all four sides coming at it, they can tip the tank over and create a problem. So we always like to set our tanks just right next to an electric fence, and we will have the supply line coming in from the side of the fence that the cattle do not have access to. So they can't step on the hose or anything like that. So I think that placement is real important to minimize any kind of troubles that you're going to have with a portable tank. Set it right next to the fence. And if it's a large enough tank, we will actually set it halfway under the fence so that they don't have access to part of that tank.
Yeah, I was going to say, I mean, considering the wire heights or the hot wire or the hot ribbon or whatever you want to call it, I was going to ask about that, but obviously the bigger tanks, yeah, straddle the fence line. Next question, it's one of those, it depends. So I thought you might be able to give a couple of different scenarios here after you say it depends. But what's your general rule, Jim, on how much to leave on the ground? For example, graze the stockpile down to 4 inches or what?
Hey, that depends.
There you go.
It's very species dependent. And 2 examples I'll throw in extreme. If you have a bluegrass, white clover, quackgrass, which is an agropyron, for those of you who don't know what quackgrass is, pretty short growing stuff, grazing that in the winter, we might take it down to 1.5 inches to 2 inches. But if on the other hand, we have big blue stem, Indian grass, tall growing prairie tall grasses, where their carbohydrate storage is in stem basis, we're still wanting to leave 6, 8, 10 inches of residual with those species. So you really have to understand the physiology of the particular grasses that you are grazing to know what the target level should be. And so now someone needs to say, hey, Gerrish, you're always talking about broad diversity. You want a lot of plant diversity in your pastures. So what do you do if you have bluegrass and big blue stem growing together? Well, if you are trying to create healthy, long-term, vigorous pastures, your grazing management needs to be targeted to the residual need of the tallest residual plant out there. So we would say, okay, we want to base our residual on the big blue stem, not the bluegrass. Now, the good thing is bluegrass is way more palatable in the dormant season than what big blue stem might be. And you can very easily end up with the bluegrass grazed to its 1.5 inch, 2 inch residual and still have big blue stem at the appropriate height. If you have orchard grass, meadow brome grass in there, they might, those are ones you're going to want to look at. Those are species where we'd like to have at least 3 or 4 inches of residual left after the dormant season. So rather than keying in on the bluegrass that they're going to graze short, and the blue stem, they're probably going to leave tall because of lesser digestibility. So you look at these in-between species and use that as your guidance.
Excellent, thank you. Next one from Kent. Jim, we've worked together for a few years, so obviously you're going to be able to identify Kent. But
I absolutely know no one named Kent in any state, and especially not in Texas.
There you go. And you don't know any Kent in Texas who's got a joke book the length of Idaho either, I guess.
No, and of course he would have said something else regarding length of. But let's go on.
Yeah, okay, let's do that. Jim, we've worked together for a few years. I thought you didn't know him.
I don't.
I've had issues with cattle when using smaller paddocks, where I can get 70 plus animal units on 3 acres. They tear up the fences where he moves to 5 acres, and they seem to be happy and no problems. Like, what are the thoughts there? Is this about induction? Is this about training the cattle to the fences prior to going into those smaller, dense areas? Okay. What is it about?
I don't know. Maybe this individual thinks he has more grass in the pasture than what he really does, and he's shortchanging the ration, the feed budget for his cattle. But two other things to think about. Some cattle don't like to get crowded, and they will blow out a fence. If that happens, I say you have inadequate fence energizer out there, because my experience in life and my view of cattle blowing out of the pasture is it is almost always due to inadequate power in the fence. So this, I forget this guy's name, but he might need a bigger energizer on his fence with greater capacity, and maybe it needs to be better grounded. There is also the idea that we can educate the cattle to what this fence is. And a great way of educating cattle is we put up a single polywire fence, hang some preferably aluminum foil, something to attract their attention to that fence, have them in a corral, and usually in 48 hours of even wild sale barn stockers coming into a corral, being put into a position of a fully energized piece of polywire, they learn what it is, and when you move them out in the pasture, they don't mess with it. But I think it starts with having absolutely knock you on your butt energizer capacity on the fence. Because I've run 170,000, 225,000 pound stock densities for 24 hours and do not have animals get out. But we do run high power fence.
That was high power. What would have happened if you turned that off?
If we turned that off, some of them would start slipping out. At that stock density, they will. Yeah. Now, some people, have the experience and tell me that they can have their fence off for a couple of weeks and the cows never notice it. Maybe they're just not pushing the envelope hard enough on stock density.
Yeah. Okay, next one. Back to feed test question. I think you sort of answered this earlier, but we had this in the list. What lab analyzers feed forage samples, or do we need to invest in the equipment to do it ourselves? I think we identified earlier that really it's about having that independent lab test, and the time turnaround is the big thing. Anything additional to add there, Jim?
No, I think that's good. We covered that.
Yeah. And, it probably is possible to get your own kit, but it may cost you 25 grand to be able to get the kit, and then you've got to have the smarts to run it too. So you might have a quick turnaround, but it might take you 3 years to work out how to do it.
Yeah, good answer.
Okay, question 17 out of, I don't know how many. Classic recommendations for stockpiling cool seasons usually involve grazing, clippings, and nitrogen application in mid-August. The idea is a full reset and time for the high quality regrowth. Is stockpile quality terribly impacted if this occurs in, say, late June instead, with a longer period of stockpile yield accumulation? Will quality really be terrible if the forage is not attempting to go reproductive and make stem seed again? Is that quality-quantity trade-off ever justified? And that's from Anonymous.
Okay. A couple of comments there. One real classic stockpile study done at the University of Missouri long before I was there. I think it was either in the 60s or early 70s by Dr. Jerry Matches, who, by the way, is one of the reasons I went to the University of Missouri, because Jerry Matches was one of my heroes. So in this study, they started stockpiling tall fescue pastures from June 15th, I think it was, July, it may have been June 1st, but sometime in June, a month later in July, in August, and in September. So if it was at the first of those months, we have a 90-day span between June 1st and September 1st. And in that study, they found that there was no additional yield advantage to starting June 1st or July 1st compared to August 1st. So you will get just as much yield of stockpiled forage if you started at August 1st compared to 30 days or 60 days earlier. Where the difference was in the digestibility of the forage. And it was, I think, for each 30 days earlier that the stockpile was begun, there was 5 to 7% lower digestibility in the feed. So that is a big, substantial difference. In a study that we did, we looked at August 1st, August 15th, August 31st as start days for stockpiling. We had no yield difference between August 1st and 15th. August 31st did give us a lower yield, but higher quality. And that's pretty well what research over the last 50 to 60 years of stockpile research has shown. This is why we emphasize to get the optimal balance of yield and quality, we begin stockpiling 60 to 75 days before the end of the growing season with cool season forages. With warm season forages, we're more like in just the 35 to 45, 50 day. It depends on what species we're talking about there. But yeah, you will give up a lot of animal performance if you stockpile all the way from June and aren't using it until winter. That's anywhere in the Midwest, the U.S. transition zone, even out here on irrigated pastures. We give up a lot of quality and don't gain any yield if we try to stockpile longer than that 60 to 75 day period. Comment about the nitrogen, because this person also asked about nitrogen fertilization. When I was in the research business, we did a lot of studies that utilized nitrogen fertilizer for growing stockpile. We also looked at grass legume mixtures. And in that research, we found that there was no cost advantage to fertilizing with nitrogen compared to growing a grass legume mixture. If we had at least 30% legume component in the mixture, there was very little yield response to adding nitrogen fertilizer, but a lot of cost added to it. On our own personal farm, in 20 plus years of stockpiling pastures for winter grazing there, we never used any nitrogen fertilizer. We relied on nitrogen availability in the soil from the legumes. We used high stock density grazing so that we would concentrate a lot of cow urine on the pastures that we were stockpiling. But we had a very effective stockpiling and winter grazing program and never one time bought a pound of nitrogen fertilizer.
Yeah. Just thinking back to that stockpiling scenario of, cool season versus warm season, days before the end of the growing season. In people's planning generally, a lot of people stockpile, okay, but what percentage of people that, stockpile well actually stockpile well with the quality aspect being nailed?
I would say, in my experience, in the cool season region, that maybe only 20%, and I'll say 20% of serious grazers really optimize the quality of their stockpile. the other 80% of serious grazers would get better animal performance, save more money if they focused a little more on that preparation of the field, how long you let it stockpile, what is the species mix you're working with. They're going to get a lot more value out of it. In the warm season environment, it is so difficult to grow a high quality stockpile that will not require a protein supplement. That, I don't push people in the warm season environment to grow a quality stockpile near as much as I do in the cool season environment, just because it's pretty well a given you're going to be doing protein supplementation.
Yeah, but there's big opportunity there for the cool season.
Absolutely.
Yeah, no, that's gold. Okay, next question. Okay. We've had a dry fall in, I should say, sorry, this is from Mike in North Missouri. Or should I say North Missouri?
You can say it either way you want. I have a pretty good idea who Mike in North Missouri is too, but I'm not going to say that.
Well, hopefully you've got a good idea. Hopefully everyone else can actually understand what I'm...
what the question's going to be.
The question's going to be, and also just understand me generally in my general Australian talk. But we've had a dry fall in North Missouri, but got some good rain, good stockpile conditions. Would you consider feeding hay in the lot for a bit to let the fescue catch up rather than keep rotating?
Yeah, that's a very good question. And we did a little bit of work in that area. It was about the time that I left the university, but it was something we were really looking at is you've made some hay earlier in the season, and you have a choice of either saving that for winter, grazing whatever the bit of stockpile you have and then start feeding hay, or you could feed it in this autumn stockpiling period, lock the cows up, feed them that hay, and let the fescue grow and stockpile. And what we basically found in a good fall with adequate moisture, if we think about a cow eating 30 pounds of hay a day, we could actually grow stockpile fescue at a faster rate than 30 pounds per day. Same thing with some of these winter annual forages like annual ryegrass and oats planted in the fall. We could grow that at a daily growth rate faster than 30 pounds per acre per day. And so by holding a cow basically in a feedlot and feeding her hay at that rate, we were gaining more days of feed and much higher quality feed than what that hay was likely to be. So yeah, I think, especially following a summer drought where you get some fall rains, go ahead and feeding your hay while it's still the active growing season actually makes economic sense. But it does depend on what species you're dealing with. If you have smooth brome grass pastures that don't have the fall growth rate potential that tall fescue does, you just as well be grazing that stuff off and saving your hay for later. Hey, it depends.
It depends. And I guess, it was an extension from what we're just talking a moment ago about the, the yield versus digestibility and, yield versus quality questions. Yeah, that was good. Next one was, in your winter strip grazing plan, how can you allow the cows to graze the pastures down to, how low can you allow the cows to graze the pastures down to? And do you also have a back fence? This is from Trudy in New Zealand. I think we've sort of covered a fair bit this off, and it sort of depends a bit, but do you have any?
I will describe one of our monitoring strategies that we use is I almost always move fences first thing in the morning. And I like to do that because animals, cattle, sheep, they have their biggest appetite for grazing in the early morning hours. So if I move a fence early in the morning, let them to the area I think they need, I can look at that in late afternoon. And if 80+% of the cattle are still in that strip that I gave them in the morning, they are telling me that is the best bite of feed in the pasture. I know I've given them enough feed and it's adequate quality. If I look at them late in the afternoon and 30, 40, 50% or more are back picking through the area that they've already grazed, they're saying, I'm not giving them enough feed. And so tomorrow I will adjust that, that's the size of that strip. And this is one of the ways you can avoid having the animals, I mean, they're going back to water, and they could, stop along the way and just, you may have left the perfect residual there, but if they keep going back across it and they keep chewing it down, you're losing your management impact. Yeah. So by always making sure that we're giving them an appropriate amount out here, watching how they're behaving late in the day, we know whether we're going to have a negative impact on our residual that they're going back and forth across the water.
It's all about observation, isn't it?
That's right.
And just on that time of day thing, you see the optimal time to move is in the morning. What's your view about those that the opinion about
the higher sugar content in the grasses in the afternoon?
Yeah, higher bricks. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. I could say, well, with dairy cows, that's going to make a difference because they're very responsive to that higher quality grass. But guess what? Most serious grass-based dairy farmers are already moving the cattle after each milking and sometimes intervening times. So you're moving them 3 or 4 times a day in a dairy situation. Grass-fed beef. You could say, oh, they ought to be responsive to higher energy as well. But a whole lot of grass-fed beef producers that I know are moving multiple times a day, so it's kind of overcoming it. So let's come back to basic cow-calf. The performance response of cow-calf, in my experience, is almost entirely volume of feed that you can put in front of them. Yeah. And so whether you put a higher quality bite in front of them by moving them at 2 o'clock in the afternoon rather than at 6 a.m. in the morning, I think in a cow-calf operation, it's largely irrelevant.
Yeah. Okay, good stuff.
If you're making hay, absolutely you want to cut your hay in the afternoon and not in the morning. But as a grazing deal, I don't think with most of the common livestock a lot of us deal with, I don't think it's a critical factor.
Yeah. Last question for the session, and we've pretty much run an hour, so we'll nip this in the bud after this one. But Jim, I'm wanting to extend my grazing season. I'm coming from scratch. What are the next 3 things that I need to do to get this right this season?
So if you've never done this before, you start out by visually looking at that pasture, saying, I think there's 60 AUDs out there, and you set your temporary fence up for a 24-hour move at 60 AUDs. And you might be wrong. You may have guessed too high, too low. You just go through the process of training your eye to visualize the feed. That is an essential piece of managing dormant season grazing. Mm-hmm. The other thing, and maybe I should have said this first, is get quality portable electric fence products. Don't try to get by with junk, with the cheapest thing you can do, posts that are going to snap when it gets to 10 degrees. If you are grazing like that, using tools like that, you will lose interest in a hurry. So invest in good quality step and post, good reels, understand how to use that. And then the final thing is keep a record of what you've done, because having that record, this is where we're going to cue back into my grazing, having that record sets you up for better understanding of what your resources are, what they're capable of doing, and it's going to give you a better planning platform for next winter.
Yeah. So at that, couldn't agree more about, training the eye, getting the observation, hazarding a guess, your best guess on what section you can put in front of them, and then how much focus do you put on? Okay, well let's look at the whole the whole season ahead of us, and if we're going to hazard a guess for the next graze, well, if that was representative of everything of the remainder of the winter until the growing season, how critical do you think it is to try and put that in context to say, okay, well, when am I going to run out of feed? Or
absolutely critical, because if you run out of feed and you do not have some hay in the stack yard to cover your time out, very often as we're progressing towards the end of winter, what do we see the price of hay and other stored feeds doing? It's going up because so many other people are in the boat of not having had a plan, not having had a feed inventory up front to know what was happening. And you want to avoid having to buy hay because you did not have a plan when it is on that rising demand market.
Yeah, and regardless of, you may be wrong at the first graze in context of the whole plan, every time that you go forward and are refining your accuracy of observation, that's just adjusting the whole plan as a whole. And before too long, you'll be in a position where you'll be able to make those earlier decisions. So
yeah, exactly. I sometimes tell the story of this was several years ago when we used to graze much later into the winter at this unit than we do now. But after the calves were weaned in September, the manager of the whole ranch, and for those who don't know, I just manage one unit of a larger ranch. I don't own this ranch. I don't own all the cattle, but we had weaned calves. They were gone. They'd taken the open cows out. And he asked me, and this was probably about the 20th of September or something. He asked me, how many cows can you graze at Patterson this winter? I said, well, how late do you want me to keep them? Well, he said, end of January would be good. And 10 minutes later, because I had records, inventory, projections, I told him I could run 330 cows to the end of January. They sent me 329, I had 329 dry cows, maybe been 328 or 329 dry cows. And they trailed them out of here on January 30th with one-day strip of feed left. I called that all the way back in late September because we had records. We understood what the cattle would need. That's how accurate you can figure a winter if you have the information to work with.
That's right. When we, straw poll our users, the biggest thing that they sort of see that having my grazing effectively, or even just these records and doing it manually, depends, how easy you want to make your life, really, is control. And if you're making those sort of decisions in a better state of mind, without the anxiety associated with planning, typically you can do as what you just explained there. I mean, and it's really achievable, and I think that's something which just seems it feels to people that it's having that level of control is so far beyond them when it actually isn't. Yeah,
it isn't. Yeah.
Yeah. All right. Well, thanks, Jim. Thanks everyone for sitting in the session yesterday, and hopefully this little add-on session was of benefit as well. And look forward to seeing you next time. Thanks as always, Jim. Enjoy the next road trip with Dawn, and we'll catch up before too long.
Okay. You're welcome. Good evening.